I'm 21 years old and my parents are divorced. My dad cheated on my mom when I was 10 and left us to marry his coworker, Kay. In the weeks following the incident, my pregnant mother ended up miscarrying from all the stress. Kay married my dad and gave birth to my half-sister, S. I remember I always hated going to my dad's place. I remember being miserable whenever I was around them. I never had a bond with S and never considered her to be my sister. Anyways, I visited my dad until I was 15 and then moved to another country with my mom where she met P. P was an amazing guy who made my mother smile again. They ended up getting married and my mom gave birth to my twin brothers. When I moved to a new country, I cut off all contact with my dad. I was supposed to visit them every Christmas, but after my brothers were born, I felt like I finally had a real family and I chose to spend my holidays with my mom, P, and little brothers. Well, last year, S was diagnosed with advanced leukemia. I did feel sorry for her, but I was not in any way affected by the news. She finally passed away on the morning of my 21st birthday. Call me heartless, but for me, it was like some neighborhood kid getting sick. I felt guilty about my feelings because I'm very protective towards my brothers, and the mere thought of any harm coming to them makes me anxious. Now for my 21st, I had a big party planned. I went through with the party and had a great time. I was careful about not posting pics on social media, but a friend ended up posting the pics on her Facebook. She tagged me in the pictures and my dad's family ended up coming across them. I was clearly having a great time in the pics with no hint of sadness. Well, Kay saw red. She made a Facebook post bashing me for celebrating my sister's death and being inconsiderate of my devastated father's feelings. She also wished death upon me. I finally had enough and proceeded to make a lengthy Facebook post detailing all the hurtful things they did to hurt me and my mother. I stated that my father was dead to me and that I wanted nothing to do with that family anymore. Lastly, I added that although it was sad that S was dead, I never considered her my sister and wasn't really affected by her death, and that they had no right to come at me for living my life and celebrating my birthday. I ended up blocking all of them. Today, my mom told me I was insensitive and that I shouldn't have made the post disowning my dad and dead half-sister. I feel like I did the right thing. I'm happy being 100% no contact and don't feel any guilt for celebrating my birthday or for the post. I was tired of their shit. So, am I the idiot?
Here's the camp story that everyone's been asking for. When I was 15, I was at an overnight summer camp in Canada for the entire summer. When I got there, I didn't know anyone, but I quickly became best friends with this girl, Caroline. We did everything together. The camp was outdoors focused, so we did a lot of canoeing, fire building. We dug holes, took shits in those holes, wiped our asses with leaves, subsequently got blistering poison ivy on our ass cracks, you know, just wholesome summer camp things. The camp was technically co-ed, but the boys and the girls were kept very separate. The camp was positioned on a lake. The girls' cabins were on one side of the lake, and the boys' cabins were on the other side. The only time that the boys and the girls ever saw each other was at the end of the summer dance, which historically got pretty out of hand because people would sneak alcohol, hook up with each other. No one was worried about getting kicked out because it was technically the last night of camp. But Caroline didn't want to wait until the dance. So one night, halfway through the summer, in the middle of the night, Caroline woke me up and whispered, "Let's go sneak over to the boys' cabin." So in the middle of the night at Canadian summer camp, my best friend Caroline wakes me up and she convinces me to sneak over to the boys' cabins with her. Apparently she had been DMing with one of the boys, even though we weren't allowed to use our phones at camp. So Caroline and I canoed across the lake. Thank God it was a full moon. We meet up with two boys, Bobby and Tim. The boy Caroline had been DMing was Bobby, but Tim and I locked eyes right away and I was immediately obsessed. He was so cute. We talked the whole night for like 3 hours, and before sunrise, Caroline and I canoe back across the lake and sneak into our cabin. Caroline tells me that she and Bobby are basically dating, and she asks me if I like Tim. I'm like, girl, I think I'm in love with Tim. The next time we see the boys is at the camp dance, and the camp dance had a reputation of getting out of hand. People would sneak fireball nips in, run off into the woods and hook up, and Caroline and I are so amped to see our respective boys. We show up to the dance, we're both looking fly as fuck, and Tim's being really cute with me, but I can tell he's distracted. Something's off. I leave for a second to go to the bathroom, and when I come back, Tim's not there. I look around, and I can't find Caroline either. So I'm at the camp dance, a censored version of Get Low is blasting, and my stomach drops. I'm like, did my friends just ditch me? To the window, to the wall, to the sweat drop down my coochie, I am freaking out right now. But through the crowd of teenagers grinding arrhythmically, I spot Bobby, who's also looking around, seemingly lost. I'm like, Bobby, where are Caroline and Tim? He doesn't know either, so we decide to go look for them outside. And lo and behold, we find Caroline and Tim leaning against the building in a hot and heavy makeout session. My pink lip gloss that I let her borrow is smudged all over his face. Bobby and I are shocked. We don't know what to say, so we just walk away together. Then I look over at Bobby, also wallowing in teenage angst and betrayal, and I think to myself, Bobby's kind of cute. Long story short, Bobby and I hook up that night, but on a physical level, it did not feel good at all. And I'm not going to go into the details because I don't want this video taken down, but let's just say the kid didn't cut his nails. 5 years ago, my parents bought a farm in rural Tennessee, and the summer after they bought it, they told my brother and I that we had to work on the farm. And I was like, oh, but I want a summer internship in New York City, and they were like, oh, that's nice, but you're going to be weed whacking in rural Tennessee. So in Tennessee, there are these snakes called copperheads, and I'm from the East Coast, and we don't have copperheads on the East Coast. So these snakes are really bad, and I know they're they're bad because people talk shit about them. People never want to say bad things about animals. Like even sharks. Like a shark could bite a woman's leg off and everyone would be like, oh, that poor shark thought she was a seal, so it's kind of her fault, you know? It's kind of on her. And we stand with the shark. And actually the shark's name is Teddy. He's been followed by marine biologists since he was just a baby. But people definitely say bad things about these snakes in Tennessee, these copperheads, because they're ruthless. You know, with predatory animals, how people are like, if you don't bother it, it won't bother you. That's apparently not the case with these copperheads. I was talking to my neighbor one day, this guy Rick, he's a big pink man. I mean, he's a white man, but his face is bright pink. He goes, oh yeah, be vigilant because these snakes can kill you. If they see you, they will attack. So I had been in Tennessee for like a month and I hadn't seen one of these snakes yet. And this one day it was so hot and I was wearing khaki shorts that day and I had the worst ass crack sweat stain I have ever had. Like if you ever Googled swass, sweaty ass, that day my butt would have been the Wikipedia image for it. So I was so hot and I had to go for a swim, so I went to the creek alone. I'm driving there and I just had this bad feeling, like I knew something bad was gonna happen. So I go to the creek to cool off for what my mom would call a dippy-doo. A dippy-doo means going for a swim, for those of you who don't know. It's the middle of the day and I'm the only person at the creek when I arrive. So I'm just getting in the water, I'm like ankle deep, and another car pulls up. And before I even looked, I could tell from the sound of the muffler that I wasn't gonna love the person behind the wheel of that car. And sure enough, I turn around to look and the vehicle has a big old Confederate flag sticker on the back. And the guy who gets out, he's not pink like my neighbor Rick. He's red, like a chili pepper that gives you horrible diarrhea. So I avoid eye contact, obviously. I don't want to engage with a man who has a Confederate flag sticker on the back of his truck. So then the man starts walking into the water, and at this point, I'm already fully submerged halfway across the creek. And as he's getting in, I see something pop up in the water between us. A little dark head with tiny beady eyes. My first copperhead sighting. And this snake looked at me, and then he looked at him, and then he disappeared under the water again before I can even say anything. So I have a moment of panic because I have no idea where this snake is going. And it happened so fast, the next thing I hear is the red man screaming that he got bit by a copperhead. He ended up being okay, and I'm not saying that anyone deserves to get bit by a poisonous snake, but that snake is an ally. The story was submitted to me by a follower who would like to remain anonymous. When I was 14, I had a best friend named Lucy, and we had one of those friendships where we were really close really quickly, which I now know is a red flag and usually a sign of a toxic friendship, but I was too young to know this then. Our favorite thing to do together was hang out at the mall. Our parents would let us go alone as long as we abided to one rule. We had to stay together at all times, and we were always pretty good about that. One night we were having a sleepover at Lucy's house and her Uncle Mike came over for dinner. Uncle Mike was pretty loud and goofy. He showed us like 8 magic tricks that night. I liked him, he was fun, but as I was helping clear dishes after dinner, I overheard Mike and Lucy's mom having a hushed conversation in the kitchen. She was like, you've had too much to drink, why don't you just spend the night? So Mike ended up sleeping over that night too. Right before going to sleep, Lucy's mom came into the bedroom, and she told us to remember to shut the bedroom door before falling asleep. When I asked Lucy why she said that, Lucy just shrugged and said, I don't know. But we made sure the bedroom door was shut just like she asked. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the feeling of someone tickling my feet. So I was having a sleepover at Lucy's house and I woke up in the middle of the night to someone or something tickling my feet. I scream and then I hear shuffling. Lucy wakes up and she's like, what's wrong? And I tell her that something was tickling my feet, but she doesn't believe me. I'm like, well, why is the door open? We shut it before we went to sleep. And she goes, relax. Sometimes it happens because there's a draft in the house. And I tell her that I think it was her uncle who was tickling my feet and she goes, oh, come on, you're hallucinating. And honestly, at the time I had a bad feeling about Lucy's reaction. It felt like she was gaslighting me and I had no idea why. A few weekends later, Lucy and I are chilling at the mall on a Saturday afternoon. My parents let us go to the mall together alone, but their one rule is that we have to stay together the whole time. They call it the buddy system. So that day, Lucy's acting weird. She keeps looking around nervously and checking her phone. She says she has to go to the bathroom, and I'm like, okay, I'll go with you. Because we always go together, even if the other person didn't have to pee. And Lucy's like, no, I'll go alone. I'll be quick. And I'm like, no, I'll just go with you. And she snaps really aggressively, and she's like, just stay here. And then she spins around and sprints away from me. So Lucy's running away from me in the mall. I sprint after her. She's super fast. She rounds a corner and then I can't find her after that. I start crying. I have no idea why my best friend ran away from me. So I sit down on a bench in the mall. I'm still crying, really overwhelmed. Then I hear someone say my name. So I look up and it's Lucy's uncle, Uncle Mike. He asks what's wrong and I tell him. He's being super nice and comforting. And then he starts rubbing my back, which made me uncomfortable, but I don't say anything. Then he offers to give me a ride home. And I say, no, I can just call my parents. And he goes, just let me give you a ride. Come on. But the way he said it the second time gave me goosebumps. It was aggressive. Like he wasn't asking me, he was telling me. So I stand up and step away from him and say, you're making me uncomfortable. I'm calling my parents. Mike glares at me and then he says, no one likes a tease. And he walks away. I told my parents what happened and they immediately called Lucy's parents. Apparently, Uncle Mike had taken a liking to me and he found out that I was going to be at the mall that day with Lucy and Mike paid her $100 to run away and leave me alone with him. He told Lucy that I liked him too and that she was being a good friend by giving us alone time. I never spoke to Lucy again after that. I used to work at a consulting company and a few years ago I went on a work trip with 4 of my colleagues to visit a client in Miami. It was me, this guy I, David, and then our two bosses, Melissa and Rick. David and I were both younger people at the company, and then Melissa and Rick were both senior, and we reported to them. So we would do our work during the day with our clients, and then at night we usually had dinner all together. And at dinner, people were typically having a lot of fun. Everyone got a little tipsy. So on the second night at dinner, I noticed that David, the coworker who's my age, keeps glancing at our boss, Melissa, really flirtatiously. So I start subtly observing them more, and I notice that Melissa keeps touching David's shoulder and laughing at all of his bad jokes. And Melissa is not only our boss, but she is married with a kid. So it is very shocking to see Melissa flirting with David, who's like 20 years younger than she is. But I also think maybe I'm reading into things, maybe they're not flirting, because they both would definitely be losing their jobs if they were having any sort of affair. But the next day, things escalated. So I keep seeing my boss, Melissa, and my coworker, David, flirting with each other on our work trip in Miami. And Melissa is much older than David, and she's married with kids. After all of our dinners, they stay at the bar, just the two of them talking. So I start to think that something is definitely up. And honestly, I don't really even want to know what's going on because I don't want to get in trouble with the company. So the last night, all four of us stay after dinner and get a drink at the bar. And David ends up going up to his hotel room early because he gets hammered. And then my other boss, Rick, goes up shortly after because he's tired. So it's just me and Melissa at the bar finishing our drinks. And as we're finishing our drinks, Melissa asks me if she can see my hotel room, which I think is weird, but I'm like, sure. So we go up and it's pretty awkward. She looks around, she's like, oh, it looks just like mine, and then she leaves. 3 weeks later, we're all back in the office and I get a call from Melissa's husband. I've only met him briefly once before at a company party, and I can tell over the phone that he's upset, like his voice is shaking a bit. And he tells me that Melissa's been acting very strange and different ever since our trip to Miami. She's been saying things like she's rethinking everything, she's not sure if she's happy anymore, everything has changed, and he wants to know what happened in Miami. And I'm honest with him. I tell him, as far as I can tell, nothing happened, but Melissa and David did appear to be very close over the trip. So he says thank you and tells me not to tell Melissa that he called me. A week later, I get a text from Melissa asking me if I want to go camping. And I'm like, oh, with other colleagues on like a retreat? And she says, no, just the two of us. And I find this bizarre and uncomfortable, so I come up with an excuse for why I can't go camping. And then she's like, all right, we'll want to get drinks after work tonight. And Melissa's my direct boss, so of course I'm going to say yes to that. We meet for drinks, she orders water, and I get a glass of wine. And after a little bit of small talk, she announces that she's pregnant and that I'm the first person she's telling. And I'm like, oh wow, congrats. And then she says, but I'm about to leave my husband. And I start to get nervous, like she's gonna tell me that she's having an affair with David. And again, I really just don't want to know about any of it. But that's not what she tells me. She instead tells me that she has developed feelings for me over the past couple months. She says that ever since our work trip to Miami, she can't stop thinking about me and she thinks she's in love. I'm like, what about David? And she goes, what about David? I was only using him to get close to you.
Imagine we get lost in love, nowhere to go when you fall out of touch. Maybe I just don't know enough of this language you call love. I'll leave it to my head to think, cause right now I'm in between. And lately I've been scared to blink, cause I've been losing too much time to sink. And all these voices in my head, like, hello, are you there? Why do I feel alone?
Been for generations. We live really close to a harbor. My grandmother once told me an insane story about a fisherman, Bill, who used to fish out of the harbor like 60 years ago. And he had a reputation for being really creepy. One time when my grandmother was a teenager, she went to the harbor and asked if she could buy striped bass from Bill. And he responded, only if you show me your left tit. And when she told him he was a repulsive pig, he was like, oh, come on, I was just joking. And that's how he would act towards women. He was vulgar and disgusting, but people put up with it because they thought he wasn't actually dangerous or threatening. Except one morning, my grandmother went to the fish market with her friend Felicity, who was visiting for the summer. They were both 17 at the time, and according to my grandmother, Felicity was extremely beautiful, but also very innocent and shy. When they arrived, Bill was there selling his fish. And my grandmother noticed right away that Bill was fixated on Felicity. He never took his eyes off of her. Later that night, my grandmother and Felicity were going to sleep. They had the windows open and started hearing strange noises outside. They thought it was probably an animal, but they went outside to check. At first, they couldn't find anything, but then my grandmother noticed something across the street that made her stomach drop. So my grandmother and Felicity went outside to investigate the strange noises. And my grandmother noticed a red truck parked across the street. She recognized the truck because she had seen it at the harbor before. It was Bill's truck. My grandmother panicked and told Felicity that they needed to get back inside immediately. She locked the door behind them. A few seconds later, they heard an engine start up, and when they got to the window to look outside, the truck was gone. The girls decided not to tell my grandma's parents because they weren't positive it was actually Bill lurking around the house, and eventually they were able to fall back asleep. A few weeks later, Felicity was walking back from the grocery store alone at dusk. She felt like someone was following her, and and when she looked over her shoulder, she saw the same red truck creeping behind her. She dropped the carton of eggs she was carrying and started sprinting, but she could hear the truck pick up speed behind her. When she got back to my grandma's house, she burst through the front door sobbing. That night, they decided it was time to tell my grandma's parents and call the police. But all the cops were local guys who knew Bill and his womanizer reputation. They just rolled their eyes and laughed and said, "Yeah, Bill's a bastard, but he's harmless." And my grandma said that when she heard them say that, she felt sick. They were wrong, and she knew it. Bill was a dangerous man. So the night of the party, they get all done up to go to the harbor where they're supposed to meet the boat driver who will take them to Graveyard Island. When they get to the harbor, it's dark and they don't see anyone. They waited for a while. My grandma starts looking around. She glances at Felicity's face. She can tell that Felicity is starting to get worried. You know, the harbor doesn't feel like the safest place for them because it's obviously Bill's stomping ground. But then they hear the sound of a group of kids coming towards them. They're all a little tipsy. They're also headed to Graveyard Island's bar. And then they hear the motor of a small boat round the corner of the harbor's jetty, and that's the boat that's there to pick them up and shuttle them to the island. When the boat got to the dock, they all hop in the boat and they go to Graveyard Island. When my grandmother and Felicity enter the bar, people are already very clearly well on their way to a big fun night. One guy is dancing on the table, a lot of people are taking shots. It's a bright, festive energy in the room. And my grandma and Felicity are immediately psyched that they're here. They're happy they came. It's kind of a crazy scene, but it's also super fun. Then the door to the bar swings open and my grandmother does a double take. Her stomach drops and she looks at Felicity to see if she's watching the same thing, and Felicity is. Bill has just entered the bar and he's immediately scanned the room and found Felicity. My grandmother asks Felicity if she wants to leave, but Felicity all of a sudden looks really determined and she says, "No, this is the most fun we've been having all summer. We're not gonna let this loser ruin it for us." Plus, the bar is super crowded, so Felicity feels like she's in control and can keep a safe distance from Bill and have the buffer of a bunch of bodies in between them. So that's what they do. The girls keep having a fun night. Felicity, of course, is on edge. She keeps glancing over her shoulder, keeping tabs on where Bill is, but they manage to keep having a good time. She always has a good distance between her and Bill. My grandmother's also keeping an eye on Bill, watching his every move out of the corner of her eye. She notices that he's drinking heavily. Every time she looks at him, he's taking another shot of whiskey, looking at the girls with menacing eyes. Then she sees Bill stagger towards the bathroom and disappear behind the bathroom doors. My grandmother relaxes for a moment, knowing that Bill is out of range. And Felicity leans into my grandmother's ear and tells her she's gonna get them both another beer from the bar. Felicity disappears into the crowd of people. The next thing my grandmother hears is a woman's yelp and a man's voice saying, "What the fuck, you stupid bitch." My grandma pushes through the sea of people and sees Felicity crying and Bill clenching Felicity's wrist violently. My grandma immediately steps in between them and tells Bill to let go of Felicity immediately, which he finally does. And then the bar owner shows up and he asks what the problem is, and Felicity explains what happened. She had been ordering a drink and all of a sudden Bill came up behind her and started groping her and grabbed both of her breasts. Instinctually, she spun around and slapped him to push him away, and that's when he grabbed her wrist. Bill's pretty hammered during this whole incident, and while Felicity's explaining the situation to the bar owner, he's just repeating in slurred words. His eyes are half open. "The bitch slapped me, the bitch slapped me." My grandmother's listening to Felicity's story and she's appalled, but she's grateful the bar owner showed up because at least he'll kick Bill out and they can maybe rebound and keep having a fun night. But that's not what happens. Instead, the bar owner chuckles, shakes his head, looks at Felicity and says, "Sorry, lady, that's the cost of having a pretty face like yours." And then he nods at Bill, who's barely able to stand up straight, and he says, "Where a man puts his hands is a man's private business." My grandmother could not believe what the bar owner was saying. A man's private business? This doesn't make any sense. Clearly it's not private business if it's affecting Felicity and other people in the bar. But on the other hand, my grandmother's not surprised that the bar owner isn't going to be doing anything about Bill. Other people, especially men, had been turning a blind eye to Bill's disgusting behavior for years. He never faced any repercussions. My grandmother knew Bill's reputation as this creepy misogynist since she was a little girl. Her mother would complain about Bill every time she got back from the fish market. And clearly no one had the wherewithal to do anything about him, evident by the fact that he stuck around for so long. So in a way, the bar owner was just like the police officers and everyone else in the town who decided to be bystanders to Bill's threatening behavior. After the bar owner announced that Bill was basically faultless and that he wasn't going to be kicking Bill out, Felicity started sobbing and stormed out of the bar. People always advised against leaving the bar on the island alone because even though the island was small, the terrain was super rough and rocky and could be very dangerous at night. And on one side of the island, there was a 30-foot cliff, so if you weren't careful, you could fall, especially when it's dark at night. My grandmother, knowing this, followed after Felicity immediately. She started shouting Felicity's name, but it was windy, so her voice kept being taken by the wind. She checked the dock on the island where the shuttle boat picked and dropped people off, but when she got there, it was just the boat driver alone on the dock, smoking a cigarette alone. He said that he hadn't seen anyone come by for the past 2 hours. My grandmother keeps searching all over the island, but as I said, it's pretty small, so there's not many places she can look. My grandmother can't find Felicity anywhere. Then my grandmother hears a splash, like someone jumping off the island's cliff into the water, and she screams Felicity's name and runs towards the edge of the cliff. And then the clouds slowly uncover the moon, and the luminous blue light of moon moonlight reveals that it is in fact Felicity in the water. She's now swam towards the edge of the cliff and is climbing up the rock wall, getting out of the water. Once Felicity is safely on top of the island, my grandmother freaks out. She's like, Felicity, what were you doing? The currents are so strong at night down there. And not to mention, you know, people say that this water is infested with hammerheads. Felicity goes, oh, I didn't know that. She's totally blasé about the whole situation, which my grandmother finds really weird. She's usually quiet, but even quieter in this moment. All she does is shrug and say, sorry, I just had to collect my thoughts. In that moment, my grandmother claims that she knew something was off with Felicity. There was something different in her eyes, like she was ready to do unprecedented things for revenge. My grandmother assumes that they're just gonna go home after that. First of all, Felicity is drenched in water, and also Creepy Bill is still lurking in the bar, so why would they go back to the bar? But Felicity insists on going back. She claims that there is still, quote, fun to be had, in a very monotone, creepy voice. As soon as the girls walk back into the bar, Felicity does something that surprises my grandmother entirely. She walks directly up to Bill and she starts flirting with him. She's like leaning into him, giggling. She's tracing her hand up and down his arm. My grandmother can't believe what she's looking at, and she can tell Bill seems almost just as surprised as my grandmother is. He's definitely shit-faced, but he is loving Felicity's attention. My grandmother is actually pretty disturbed by this though, so she goes up to them and tries to intervene, but Felicity physically pushes her away and says, excuse me, you're interrupting a conversation here. My grandmother just keeps watching them from like 10 feet away. She's in shock. She really doesn't know what to do. And then she sees Felicity lean in for a kiss, and all of a sudden, Bill and Felicity are making out in front of everyone at the bar. Just as this is happening, the bar owner walks by my grandmother and says, see? She was into it the whole time. She was probably asking for it. My grandmother goes, no, she wasn't. This guy is disgusting. And the bar owner responds, clearly your friend doesn't think so. My grandmother is embarrassed for both herself and Felicity and decides she needs to put an end to this. So she goes up to them a second time, more stern and aggressive, and says, Felicity, what are you doing? I want to go home. Let's go. This man is disgusting. We're leaving. But Felicity looks my grandmother directly in the eyes and she says, go home yourself. I'm staying here with Bill. My grandmother just stares at her friend, shocked. And Bill, from the side, slurs, you heard her. My grandmother is now pissed, so she says, Felicity, this is your last chance. I'm leaving right now. She points at Bill. This guy's a fucking creep and you know it. Go away. Felicity responds. My grandmother was so confused, but she knew in her heart, my grandmother was confused, but she knew in her heart that Felicity was up to something. It was too unbelievable that she was suddenly attracted to Bill. But my grandmother leaves, she gets in the shuttle boat and she heads home. She's full of mixed emotions. She feels kind of guilty for leaving Felicity on one hand, but she's also really angry at her friend who's kind of abandoned her as well. It is, after all, 1 a.m. It's an appropriate time to call it a night and go home. My grandmother goes to sleep, and she wakes up to the noise of her bedroom door opening, and she sees Felicity tiptoeing in. She looks out the window and she can see the sun's rising at this point, the birds are chirping, and she glances at her watch and she sees that it's 5:30 in the morning. Felicity was out all night. The next morning is pretty awkward between my grandmother and Felicity. They're not really talking much. My grandmother doesn't really ask for that many details about the night before because, quite honestly, she doesn't really want to know them, but when she does ask for little tidbits, Felicity isn't particularly forthcoming either. She doesn't divulge much. Later that day, my grandmother runs into some friends who are also at the Graveyard Island bar the night before, and they tell her that they saw Bill and Felicity leave the bar together, but those are the only details she gets. A few days later, my grandmother's mom asks her to go to the Harbor's fish market to buy some cod for dinner that night. My grandmother goes alone on her walk there. She gets ready to be repulsed by Bill, but when she gets there, Bill isn't at the fish market. At first she doesn't say anything, but then her curiosity gets the best of her, and she asks one of the other fishermen where Bill is, and he shrugs and says, we haven't seen Bill since the weekend. We think he's sick or something, but we haven't heard from him. For the rest of the week, Bill doesn't show up for work. A couple of the fishermen think it's odd, but no one goes looking for him. Bill wasn't a very likable guy, so he didn't have any close friends who would check in on him if he didn't show up to work for a few days. No one was particularly worried about Bill's well-being. But then, the following Monday, Bill doesn't show up for work again, and people start to get suspicious. A few of the fishermen go to Bill's house and look inside, and no one's there. Then they go to the police and inform the police that they believe Bill has gone missing. The police open a formal investigation. The police interview several people who were with Bill the night before, including Felicity. All of the people tell the police that the last place they saw Bill was partying at the bar on Graveyard Island. Felicity tells the police that she was with him on Graveyard Island, and they actually boated back to the mainland together, but once they got to the harbor, Felicity told them she was going home and assumed that he was also going to his own home. So they went their separate ways after they got back to the harbor. The investigation lasts a couple months, but they don't really get any answers, so the police conclude that he probably just left town and took off to somewhere else. Maybe he wanted to start fresh in a new place with no strings attached. It's not like he had a particularly good reputation here. The police stop their investigation. It becomes a cold case. A year later, a visiting fisherman is fishing off of Graveyard Island, and he gets a hammerhead shark stuck in his net. Usually when a shark gets stuck in a fisherman's net, they try to save it so that it can swim away, but this shark was so tangled that it actually choked on the net and died. The fisherman took it back to the harbor. When he got there, he cut it open, and no noticed that there was something shiny in its intestines. He looked closer and saw that it was a watch. A few of the other local fishermen come over to look at the shark, and one of them recognizes the watch. It was Bill's watch. Bill would always brag about how the watch was worth $300, which everyone knew was bullshit. Bill could never afford a $300 watch. He spent all of his money on booze. They bring the watch to the police station, and the police are relieved to receive it as a piece of evidence because they use it to finally close the case. They conclude that the night that Bill went missing, he must have been drunkenly lingering at the harbor after Felicity had left him, fallen into the ocean, and gotten attacked by a hammerhead. They're still slightly confused why they never found the rest of his remains at the harbor the next day or the weeks that followed, but they figure this is the only plausible explanation for why Bill disappeared. My grandmother always said that there was one person the police never interviewed during their investigation, the boat driver who shuttled people back and forth from Graveyard Island the night that Bill went missing. At the time, the boat driver knew the investigation was going on, but he especially hated Bill for the way he was known to treat women. It was the 1950s after all, and it wasn't particularly cool to be a feminist back then, but this boat driver was one. So when he found out that Bill went missing, he really didn't give a shit. Unless the police asked him for information, he wasn't going to take time out of his day to go there and help them with the investigation. The boat driver knew that Bill made women feel uncomfortable literally every single day, so if he was missing, maybe that was a good thing for the town. As years went by, my grandmother actually grew to become friends with the boat driver, whose name is Tom. My grandmother and Tom remained good friends until old age. Tom sadly passed away before my grandmother when he was 73. However, according to my grandmother, there was one night when Tom and she were having kind of a boozy night together. They were drinking, sharing stories, and the topic of Bill's disappearance came up. They were bonding about how awful Bill was. And then all of a sudden, Tom lowered his voice, leaned into my grandmother's ear and said, "You know, the night that Bill went missing, I drove Felicity back from Graveyard Island, and she was not with Bill. She was all alone." And my grandmother and Tom looked at each other, and they were thinking the exact same thing. That was not the story that Felicity told the police. She had told them that she was last with him at the harbor, after they had returned from the island. Since that discovery, my grandmother has wondered a lot about what really happened the night that Bill went missing. The theory she believes in most is this. Felicity decided to seduce Bill that night because she was really luring him into a trap. When they left the bar that night, instead of going directly to the shuttle boat, Felicity suggested that they go to the island's cliff to look out at the moon. While Bill drunkenly gazed at the moon with his barely functional brain cells, Felicity pushed him off the cliff. He probably yelled, "You stupid bitch," as he fell into his cold, saltwater death, but his misogyny was not going to save him at that point. And Felicity knew this, so she was unbothered by his final words to her. After Felicity pushed Bill into his doom, she casually got onto the shuttle boat with Tom, where she was delivered back to the mainland. She then walked home and crawled into the twin bed next to my grandmother's at 5:30 in the morning. When the police asked Felicity about Bill's disappearance the following week, Felicity feigned ignorance. But that was just my grandmother's theory. She never knew what really happened. My grandmother and Felicity actually remained friends well into their old age, but my grandmother never felt it was appropriate to ask Felicity for the truth. Because, after all, what a lady does late at night is a lady's private business.
So there's this lighthouse that you can see from my house, and my mom used to tell me a story about a woman who used to live there. No one lives in it now, but there used to be this young woman in her 20s who lived there like 30 years ago. Apparently she came from a really broken home. Her mom and sister died in a horrible car crash, and her dad was an abusive drug addict. So the harbor master let her live in the lighthouse and paid her a small salary for taking care of it. So she had been living there for a couple months, and that's when she noticed weird things starting to happen. Some of her belongings would occasionally go missing. Like one time she couldn't find her flashlight, and she looked for it everywhere. And finally she found it under her bed, which was weird because she knew she had never put it there. But then weirder stuff started to happen. So at this point, she had been living at the lighthouse for like 6 months, and she was getting pretty creeped out because bizarre things started happening. She started noticing that some of her food was going missing, but she was the only person who lived in the lighthouse, obviously, and she was really specific about what food she bought when she went grocery shopping. She went to the grocery store at the beginning of each week, and for example, she would always buy 7 apples, one for each day of the week, and she was always really precise about that. But there were a few Sundays where she didn't have any apples left by the end of the week, which didn't make any sense because she always counted at the grocery store to make sure she had 7 apples. So she started getting more and more creeped out, but she didn't want to say anything because she had nowhere else to live. And then one night, she woke up in the middle of the night to something touching her feet at the end of her bed. So she woke up in the middle of the night to something tickling her feet, and she was really freaked out, obviously. So she jumped out of bed and turned all the lights in the lighthouse on. But when the lights came on, there was nothing there. She checked through the whole lighthouse and couldn't find anything. Nothing like that ever happened again, but she never slept well after that. She stayed in the lighthouse for like 5 more months, but eventually she found a new place to live, got a new job. She ended up moving to an entirely different state. And then one day, like a year later, she's at work, sitting at her desk, and she's going through old pictures on her phone. And she finds an album on her phone called You at Night. And she's thinking, what? I do not remember making this album. So she clicks into it and she gasps because all the pictures in the album are of her sleeping in her old bed at the lighthouse. One summer after my sophomore year of college, I was working on an organic farm in Switzerland. But the farm was in this really remote area, so every few days I had to go to the closest town to run errands. But I didn't have a car or anything, so I would hitch rides. And even though hitchhiking is usually a pretty sketchy thing to do as a single woman in a foreign country, I normally felt pretty safe, except for this one time. I was on my way back to the farm and I had hitched a ride on a motorcycle. And then this other guy on a motorcycle came up next to us and was trying to tell me something. And it's super windy, obviously, so I can't hear anything. And we were going like 40 miles per hour on these tiny roads. He's holding a necklace in his other hand that he's like dangling around. I'm like, no, I don't want the necklace. I don't have any cash on me. But he kept following us and trying to sell it. So finally we get to the spot where I'm supposed to be dropped off. And this guy's been following us for like 30 minutes. And from the place where I'm dropped off, it's still a 10-minute walk to the farm. And the sun is setting, it's getting dark. So I start walking and this guy keeps following me. And I start to get this really bad feeling. So I'm getting worried about this guy following me. So I turn to him and say, all I have is $2 American. And that was true. I actually only had $2 in cash on me at that time. And he keeps repeating this word that I don't understand. Oh, pal. That's what he keeps saying over and over again. So I pull out the $2 and I look at him and I'm like, this is all I have. And he's like, okay. And he gives me the necklace and I give him the $2. And I'm not even sure if he'll leave me alone at this point. But after I buy the necklace, he turns around and starts walking away. So I'm really relieved. Obviously, I look at the necklace. I can barely see it because it's dark. And when I finally get back to the farm, I have dinner and then I go to bed. And while I'm getting ready for bed, I'm emptying my pockets and I look more closely at the necklace. And I realize it's actually really pretty. It's like a white iridescent gem. And I look it up and I realize it's probably an opal, which would make sense because opal sounds a lot like the word the guy kept repeating. So I decide to wear it because I actually really like it. So I put it on and then I go to bed. But in the middle of the night, I wake up to something I'd never experienced before. So I wake up and it feels like the whole house is shaking. And I start freaking out, but suddenly it stops completely. And normally in the middle of the night, there are a lot of animal noises on the farm, but everything was silent. So the next morning, I find out that it was an earthquake, which is pretty uncommon for that area. And when the sun comes out, we actually see that the earthquake caused some legitimate damage. There was a little shed on the property that had fallen apart, and we spent the rest of the day rebuilding it. But then more and more weird stuff started to happen. Like the next day, for example, the farm had this little pond of koi fish, and all of a sudden they all died. We found them all floating, like 20 of them, belly up. It looked like they'd gotten poisoned or something, but we couldn't figure out how. And then like 4 days later, something even worse happened. The farm had this really cute dog named Chicken, who would always be hanging around, but then went missing for like 2 days. So after a couple days, we decided to go look for Chicken in the rainforest. We all decided to go look for him separately in different directions, and I'm probably searching for like an hour, and then I hear something rustling in the bushes, and I find Chicken. But normally Chicken's super friendly, but he's like growling at me and baring his teeth, and his eyes look really weird, like they're going in different directions. But I managed to put the leash on him, and we start walking. I find the other people. We decide to go back to the house. We make dinner. We're happy the Chicken's safe. So we're eating dinner, and Chicken starts shaking uncontrollably. He's whimpering. He's having a seizure, and then he dies right in front of us. It was horrible. So the next day we have to bury Chicken. But then 2 weeks after we bury him, all the arugula on the farm dies. And more little things start going wrong too. And it just got so bad that I decided to go home early, back to the US. And on my flight home, I had the worst turbulence I've ever had on a flight. Like the person next to me was vomiting. It was the worst plane ride I had ever been on. So I get back to Boston and I'm at baggage claim. And there's this old woman who's also at baggage claim who keeps giving me nasty looks. So I'm trying to avoid eye contact. But then she comes over and she tries to talk to me. And she goes, your necklace. And she points to my necklace. She goes, opal. That's an evil necklace. She goes, you should not wear that at airports. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what to say back to her. And then I get home and I take a shower and I take off the necklace. But when I get out of the shower, I hesitate before I put the necklace back on. So I go to my phone and I Google meaning of opal. And I found on Wikipedia that opals are sometimes known as demon stones, and that the stone is associated with bad luck. In Russia, the stone symbolizes an evil eye, and anyone wearing it or associated with the stone also is evil themselves. Whoops. So now that opal necklace is somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean because that's where I threw it. I took a class in college called Women's Reproductive Health. I took it instead of a really fun sociology lecture that all my friends were taking called Demystifying the Hipster. That was the actual name of the class. I was like, why would I spend an entire semester trying to debunk the mystery of white men who do improv? Like, okay, they don't need to be lifted up. They're already boldly creating art with one-word suggestions from the audience. But I'm also a feminist. And I told my friends, I said, I'm not taking Demystifying the Hipster with you guys. Instead, I'm taking Women's Reproductive Health. Because women's studies does not get the academic attention it deserves, and I want to actively be a part of changing that. Also, at the time, I did in fact need a science credit, and it was the only class that fit into my schedule. One of the craziest things I learned in the class was about the study done in Argentina. I took a class in college called Women's Reproductive Health. One of the craziest things I learned in the class was about the study done in Argentina that revealed that the rate of C-sections performed by male doctors spikes in the hours before the Argentinian soccer team plays. Because natural births, as we know, can take like 20 hours. And C-sections are relatively very fast. You can just cut the mother open and boom, there's your baby. So a doctor can just perform the C-section, be done with the delivery, wash his hands, hurry over to the bar, and catch the game. The magic of medicine. And listen, I was a college athlete, I'm from Boston, and I do believe sports are incredibly fun and a deeply important part of our culture. I just think men have the tendency to take it a little too far. Like, for example, when Argentinian male doctors sedate and cut open pregnant women so they don't have to miss the game. But I don't know, maybe that's just me.